The radar screen exploded with green blips, dozens of them, streaming south like a plague of electric locusts. I watched the phosphorescent dots multiply across the glowing display, my heart hammering against my ribs as the impossible became reality. 150 contacts. Maybe more. The largest kamikaze raid in history was bearing down on us, and we were about to find out if American steel could withstand the fury of men who had already chosen to die. General Quarters. General Quarters. All hands man your battle stations. The klaxons shrieked through every compartment of the USS Birmingham, their piercing wail cutting through the humid Pacific air like a blade. Around me, the combatant formation center erupted into controlled chaos as sailors rushed to their stations, their faces pale in the green glow of the radar screens. I am Lieutenant Commander James McKenzie, gunnery officer aboard the light cruiser Birmingham, and on this morning of April 6, 1945, I was about to witness hell itself descend from the heavens. The campaign for Okinawa had been raging for 5 days. We'd been pounding the Japanese positions on the island with everything we had, 6-inch guns, 8-inch guns from the heavy cruisers, and the massive 16-inch rifles of the battleships. The thunder of our bombardment rolled across the water day and night, turning the coral beaches into a moonscape of craters and twisted metal. But the Japanese weren't just waiting to die on the beaches. They were planning something bigger, something that would make Pearl Harbor look like a pinprick. They called it Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemum, and it was their largest kamikaze operation of the war. I'd been tracking reports all morning from our forward picket destroyers stationed 60 miles north of Okinawa. The little tin cans were our early warning system, brave ships positioned like sentries in the empty ocean to give us precious minutes of warning before the Kamikaze arrived. But this morning, the reports were different. Terrifying, CIC to Gunnery. The metallic voice crackled through my headset. We're getting reports from Bush and Coalhound. They're under heavy attack, requesting immediate assistance. I keyed my microphone. Gunnery to CIC. What's the situation? Sir, they're reporting massive formations of Japanese aircraft. Looks like the big one we've been waiting for. The big one. We'd all known it was coming. Intelligence had been warning us for weeks that the Japanese were massing every available aircraft in the home islands for one final, desperate blow. Kamikaze attacks had been increasing in frequency and intensity since the Okinawa invasion began, but this was different. This was their last card to play. I made my way through the ship's passageways to the main battery director, climbing the steel ladders that led to my battle station high above the main deck. The Birmingham was a Cleveland-class light cruiser, 610 feet of American steel armed with 12 6-inch guns and 4 triple turrets. She'd been my home for 2 years, and I knew every rivet, every pipe, every electrical cable in her hull. From my position in the director, I could see the entire formation spread out across the blue Pacific. We were part of Task Force 58, the most powerful naval force ever assembled. Fast carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stretched to the horizon, their gray hulls cutting wide wakes through the swells. The carrier Yorktown was barely visible to the south, her flight deck crowded with Hellcats and Corsairs preparing for launch. All stations. This is the captain, came the voice of Commander Edward Hogan over the ship's intercom. We have confirmed reports of large enemy formations approaching from the north. This appears to be the coordinated attack we've been expecting. All gun crews stand by. We're going to give these sons of the fight of their lives. I adjusted my sound-powered headset and checked the gun director's optical rangefinder. The massive instrument could track targets out to 20 miles, and to date we were going to need every inch of that range. Around me, my gun crew made final preparations, checking electrical connections, testing the mechanical computers that would calculate firing solutions, ensuring the optical equipment was crystal clear. Petty Officer First Class Tommy Rodriguez, my chief gunner's mate, climbed up beside me, a stocky Mexican-American from Los Angeles. Rodriguez had been with me since the Guadalcanal campaign. He'd seen more action than most men could handle and still kept his sense of humor. "Looks like we're going to earn our pay today, Mr. McKenzie," he said, adjusting his steel helmet. "That we are, Rodriguez. That we are." The first wave hit at 11:30 hours. The divine wind unleashes that came out of the northwest like a swarm of angry hornets, their engines screaming as they dove from 15,000 feet. The Combat Air Patrol, our defending fighters, had been vectored north to intercept them, but there were too many. For every Japanese plane the Hellcats shot down, 2 more seemed to take its place. Bogies bearings are 15, range 12 miles and closing fast. The voice of the air search radar operator crackled through my headset. "Count approximately 40 aircraft in the first wave." I swung the director around to the northwest, the electric motors whining as the massive optical instrument tracked across the sky. There, tiny specks against the blue, growing larger by the second. They were flying in loose formation, not the tight groups we'd learned to expect from conventional attacks. These pilots weren't worried about maintaining formation. They were worried about only one thing: hitting their targets. "All guns, air action starboard," I called into my microphone. "Range 12,000 yards and closing." The Birmingham's main battery swung around with mechanical precision, 4 triple turrets rotating to point their 12 6-inch guns toward the approaching enemy. The smaller guns, the 20mm and 40mm anti-aircraft mounts, were already tracking targets, their crews hunched over their sights. "Commence firing," I shouted. The ship erupted in thunder. 12 6-inch guns fired in perfect synchronization, their muzzle flashes lighting up the sea like lightning. The 40mm guns joined in, their rapid-fire shells streaming toward the enemy in glowing arcs. The sound was deafening, a continuous roar that seemed to shake the very air. But they kept coming. I watched it through the director's optics as our shells burst among the Japanese formations like deadly flowers. Several aircraft disintegrated in mid-air, their wings shearing off as they tumbled toward the ocean. But for every plane we shot down, another took its place. They were coming in waves, each formation following the one before it like links in a chain of death. "Director to Mount 51, I called to the forward turret. Target bearing 020, range 8,000 yards. Single aircraft, diving. Mount 51, target acquired." The forward turret swung around and fired, its 3 guns sending a salvo of armor-piercing shells toward a lone Judy dive bomber that had broken away from the main formation. The shells bracketed the target, exploding in black puffs of smoke and shrapnel. The Judy wavered, smoke streaming from its engine, but kept coming. "He's hit but still flying," Rodriguez shouted over the din of gunfire. "The crazy bastard's still coming." The Japanese pilot held his dive, his plane growing larger in my optical sight with each passing second. I could see the red rising sun painted on his wings, the dark silhouette of his cockpit canopy. He was less than 2,000 yards away now, close enough that I could make out individual details of his aircraft. "All guns, concentrate on that Judy," I commanded. "Bring him down." Every gun on the starboard side of the ship opened fire. 20mm shells, 40mm shells, and 6-inch high explosive rounds filled the air with lethal metal. The Judy flew through a wall of steel and explosive, pieces of his aircraft flying off like confetti. His port wing folded back, then his engine caught fire. But he kept coming. Rodriguez whispered, "He's not pulling out." The burning Judy screamed down toward the Birmingham's bridge, trailing black smoke and orange flame. At the last second, just when it seemed certain he would hit us, the damaged aircraft rolled to starboard and crashed into the sea barely 50 yards from our hull. The impact sent up a towering column of water that drenched the forward gun mounts. "Splash one," someone shouted over the intercom. But there was no time to celebrate. The radar screens were still covered with contacts, and more Japanese aircraft were diving on the formation every minute. To the north, I could see the destroyers Bush and Coalhound fighting for their lives. They were surrounded by waterspouts from near misses and smoke from fires on their superstructures. The Bush was listing to starboard, her forward guns still firing even as Kamikaze pilots dove on her from 3 different directions. "Mr. McKenzie." Rodriguez grabbed my arm and pointed to the east. "Look at the Yorktown." The big carrier was under attack by at least 6 Japanese aircraft simultaneously. Her escort destroyers were throwing up a curtain of anti-aircraft fire, but I could see 2 Kamikazes breaking through the defensive screen. One was a Zero fighter, its landing gear extended to act as dive brakes. The other was a twin-engine Francis bomber, smoke streaming from its port engine. The Zero reached the carrier first, diving almost vertically toward the flight deck. At the last possible moment, it pulled up slightly and crashed into the carrier's island structure just below the bridge. The explosion was enormous, a ball of orange fire that billowed hundreds of feet into the air. But the Yorktown was tough. She was an Essex-class fleet carrier, built to take punishment. Her damage control parties were already fighting the fires, and her remaining guns continued to fire at the second attacker. The Francis bomber never made it a destroyer. I think it was the Hazelwood, caught it with a direct hit from her 5-inch guns. The bomber exploded in midair, its debris raining down on the ocean in 1,000 pieces. "CIC to Gunnery," came the voice in my headset. "We're tracking another large formation approaching from the northeast. Range 15 miles and closing. Looks like at least 60 aircraft. 60 more." I felt my stomach clench. We'd been fighting for less than an hour, and already we'd expended thousands of rounds of ammunition. Our gun barrels were so hot they were glowing cherry red, and several of the 20mm guns had jammed from overheating. "Rodriguez, get word to the ammunition parties," I ordered. "We need more shells topside, and we need them fast. And tell the gunners' mates to check those overheated 20s. We're going to need every gun we've got." "Aye, aye, sir." But the Japanese weren't finished with us yet. As Rodriguez headed below to coordinate ammunition supply, I spotted something that made my blood freeze. A single aircraft, flying low and fast from the northwest. It was a Zeke, a Zero fighter, but this one was different. It was flying straight and level, making no effort to evade our fire. And it was headed directly for the Birmingham. All guns, target bearing 270, range 3,000 yards. I shouted into my microphone. Single aircraft, low and fast. The Zeke was less than a mile away now, flying barely 50 feet above the water. I could see the pilot's helmet in the cockpit, his white scarf streaming behind him in the slipstream. He was flying with mechanical precision, his course as straight as an arrow aimed at our starboard side. Every gun on the ship that could bear opened fire. The air filled with tracer rounds, their red streaks converging on the approaching fighter. The Zeke flew through the storm of metal without wavering, pieces of his aircraft flying off as shells found their mark. His port aileron was shot away. His engine cowling was riddled with holes. Smoke began streaming from his engine, but he kept coming, his propeller spinning, his gun silent. He wasn't trying to fight us. He was trying to die with us. "He's going to hit us," someone screamed over the intercom. The Zeke was less than 500 yards away now, close enough that I could see the expression on the pilot's face. He was young, probably no more than 20, and his features were set in a mask of grim determination. This was a boy who had made his peace with death, who had written his final letters home and said his prayers to his ancestors. "All hands, brace for impact." Captain Hogan's voice boomed over the ship's intercom. The Zeke held his course, flying straight into the teeth of our defensive fire. At the last second, with barely 100 yards separating us, a 40mm shell from Mount 53 caught him square in the engine. The fighter exploded in a brilliant flash of orange and white, its wreckage tumbling end over end before splashing into the sea just 20 yards from our hull. The concussion from the explosion rattled the ship's superstructure and shattered windows in the pilot house. But we were alive, and the Birmingham was still fighting. The attacks continued without let-up. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft dove on our formation, each pilot determined to take an American ship with him to the bottom of the Pacific. They came in Zeeks and Judys, in Vals and Kates, in twin-engine Bettys and Nels. Some flew alone, others in small groups. All of them shared the same deadly purpose. By 1400 hours, the ammunition parties were running low on shells. The ready service magazines for the 6-inch guns were nearly empty, and we were down to our last few hundred rounds of 20-millimeter ammunition. But the Japanese kept coming. "Sir, we've got a problem," Rodriguez reported as he climbed back up to the director. His face was streaked with powder burns and sweat, and his shirt was torn from crawling through the ammunition handling rooms. "The forward magazines are running low. We've got maybe 50 rounds left for the main battery." 50 rounds. In a normal engagement, we would have fired that many shells in the first 10 minutes. But this wasn't a normal engagement. This was a fight for survival against an enemy that had nothing left to lose. "What about the secondary batteries?" I asked. "The 40s are in better shape, but not by much. We've been firing continuously for 3 hours. Some of the gun crews are dropping from exhaustion." I looked around the formation. The destroyers Bush and Coalhound were gone, overwhelmed by repeated kamikaze attacks. The Bush had taken 5 direct hits before she rolled over and sank, her colors still flying. The Coalhound had fought until the end, her guns firing even as she slipped beneath the waves. But we were still here. The Birmingham was still fighting, still afloat, still defiant. And the Japanese were paying a terrible price for their fanaticism. "CIC to Gunnery," came the voice in my headset. "We're getting reports from the cap. They estimate at least 300 enemy aircraft shot down so far. But there are more formations approaching from the north. 300 aircraft. That was an entire air group destroyed in a single day." The Japanese were bleeding their air forces white, throwing away pilots and planes they couldn't replace. But they were also inflicting damage on us. Several ships had been hit and damaged, and we'd lost 2 destroyers and a minesweeper. "Mr. McKenzie," Rodriguez said quietly, "do you think we can hold out?" I looked at him, this tough, experienced sailor who had faced death a dozen times and never showed fear. Now I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the strain of hours of continuous combat. He was asking the question that every man on the ship was thinking. "We're going to hold out," I said firmly. "We're Americans, Rodriguez. We don't give up, we don't give in, and we sure as hell don't let a bunch of fanatics sink our ship." He nodded, his confidence restored. "Yes, sir." "What are your orders?" "Get below and organize the ammunition parties. I want every shell we've got brought topside. Strip the storage rooms if you have to. And tell the damage control parties to stand by. If we take a hit, I want those fires out in 5 minutes." "Aye, aye, sir." As Rodriguez headed below, I swept the sky with my binoculars. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the water. In the distance, I could see smoke rising from several ships in the formation. The carrier Intrepid had been hit by a kamikaze and was listing slightly to port, but her damage control parties had the fires under control. Suddenly, my headset crackled with an urgent transmission from the radar operator. "CIC to Gunnery. Large formation approaching from the northwest. Range 20 miles and closing. Count approximately 80 aircraft. 80 more." I felt fatigue wash over me like a wave. We'd been fighting for 4 hours, and now another major attack was forming up. But there was no choice. We would fight them, just as we had fought all the others. "All guns, prepare for air action port," I commanded. "Here they come again." The sun was setting behind us as the largest kamikaze formation of the day approached from the northwest. Through my binoculars, I could see them spread across the sky like a swarm of locusts, Zeeks and Judys, Vals and Kates, even a few of the new Shiddens that we'd been seeing more frequently. But this time, something was different. Our combat air patrol had been reinforced with fresh fighters from the carriers, and they were tearing into the Japanese formations with renewed fury. I watched Hellcats and Corsairs diving through the enemy aircraft, their machine guns blazing, their pilots fighting with the desperation of men who knew this might be the decisive moment. "Look at those Navy pilots go," Rodriguez shouted, pointing to the northwest where a lone Corsair was taking on 3 Japanese fighters simultaneously. The gull-winged fighter rolled and dove, its 650 caliber machine guns chattering as it poured lead into the enemy formation. One of the Zeeks caught fire and spun into the sea. The second pulled up sharply and stalled, giving the Corsair pilot a perfect shot. The Japanese fighter disintegrated under the impact of the heavy machine gun bullets. But the third Zeke got behind the American fighter and opened fire. I watched helplessly as the Corsair's engine began streaming smoke. The pilot was trying to make it back to his carrier, but the Zeke was closing fast. "Come on, you son of a," I muttered under my breath. "You can make it." The Corsair was losing altitude, its engine coughing and sputtering. The Japanese pilot was lining up for the killing shot when suddenly another American fighter, a Hellcat from the Yorktown, dove out of the sun and caught the Zeke with a burst-off machine gun fire. The Japanese plane exploded in a ball of flame, its wreckage tumbling toward the ocean. The damaged Corsair limped back toward the carrier formation, trailing smoke but still flying. In the distance, I could see the deck crews on the Intrepid preparing to recover their wounded bird. But the main enemy formation was still coming. Despite the mauling they were taking from our fighters, at least 40 Japanese aircraft had broken through the defensive screen and were diving on our ships. "All guns, commence firing," I commanded. The Birmingham erupted in flame and thunder once again. Our remaining shells streaked toward the enemy formations, exploding among them in black bursts of smoke and shrapnel. The 40mm guns added their rapid-fire chatter to the din, while the 20mm guns sprayed lead at any target that came within range. I watched through my director optics as a Judy dive bomber broke away from the main formation and began its death dive toward the battleship Missouri. The big battle wagon's anti-aircraft guns opened up with a roar that could be heard for miles, her 16 5-inch guns firing in rapid succession. The Judy flew through a wall off steel and explosive, pieces of its aircraft flying off like confetti. But the pilot held his dive, his plane growing larger in my sight with each passing second. At the last moment, just when it seemed certain he would hit the battleship superstructure, the damaged aircraft rolled to port and crashed into the sea barely 30 yards from the Missouri's hull. "Splash one," someone shouted over the intercom. But there were more coming. A formation of 6 Zeeks had broken through our defensive fire and were approaching the Birmingham from 3 different directions. They were flying low, barely 50 feet above the water, their engines screaming as they raced toward us. Multiple targets, bearing 090, 270, and 345. I shouted into my microphone. "All guns, pick your targets." The ship's anti-aircraft guns swung around to track the approaching fighters. But with targets coming from 3 directions simultaneously, we couldn't concentrate our fire. Each gun mount would have to fight its own battle. Mount 51 engaged the fighters approaching from the east. Mount 53 tracked the targets coming from the northwest. The smaller guns, the 40s and 20s, divided their attention among all 3 groups. The first Zeke reached us from the east, flying straight and level despite the storm of defensive fire. I could see the pilot's white scarf streaming behind him, his propeller spinning as he held his course with mechanical precision. Mount 51 caught him with a direct hit from all 3 guns. The fighter exploded in a brilliant flash of orange and white. its wreckage tumbling end over end before splashing into the sea barely 50 yards from our starboard side. But the second Zeke was right behind him, and this one was flying slightly higher. He rolled into a shallow dive, his course aimed directly at our bridge superstructure. "He's going to hit the bridge," Rodriguez shouted. Every gun on the ship that could bear opened fire. The air filled with tracer rounds, their red streaks converging on the approaching fighter. The Zeke flew through the storm of metal, pieces of his aircraft flying off as shells found their mark. His port wing was shot away, his engine cowling was riddled with holes. Smoke began streaming from his engine, but he kept coming, his propeller spinning, his course as straight as an arrow aimed at our heart. At the last second, with barely 50 yards separating us, a 40mm shell from Mount 53 caught him square in the cockpit. The fighter exploded in a brilliant flash, its wreckage tumbling into the sea just 20 yards from our hull. The concussion from the explosion rattled the ship's superstructure and shattered windows in the pilot house. But we were alive, and the Birmingham was still fighting. By 1800 hours, the attacks had finally ended. The last Japanese aircraft had either been shot down or had returned to their bases in the home islands. The sun was setting behind us, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded me too much of the explosions I'd been watching all day. The damage reports were still coming in from throughout the task force. The destroyers Bush, Coalhound, and Emmons had been sunk. The destroyer Rodman had been severely damaged, but was still afloat. The carriers Yorktown and Intrepid had both been hit, but were still operational. But we had survived. The Birmingham was still afloat, still fighting, still defiant. And the Japanese had paid a terrible price for their fanaticism. "CIC to Gunnery," came the voice in my headset. "Final damage assessment from the cap. They're estimating at least 350 enemy aircraft destroyed today. That's the largest single-day loss in Japanese aviation history. 350 aircraft. Gone. Along with their pilots, young men who had been trained to fly, not to die. The Japanese had thrown away an entire generation of aviators in a single day. And for what? They had sunk 3 destroyers and damaged a handful of other ships. It was a tactical victory for them, but a strategic disaster. I climbed down from the director and walked to the ship's rail. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the water. In the distance, I could see the other ships of the task force maintaining their formation, their gray hulls cutting white wakes through the swells. Rodriguez appeared beside me, his face streaked with powder burns and exhaustion. "Hell of a day, Mr. McKenzie." "Hell of a day," I agreed. "How are the men?" "Tired. Scared. But proud. We showed those bastards what American steel can do." I nodded, looking out at the peaceful ocean. It was hard to believe that just hours before, this same water had been filled with burning aircraft and exploding ships. Now it was calm, almost serene, as if the ocean itself was mourning the young men who had died beneath its waves. "You know what the worst part is?" I said quietly. "What's that, sir?" "Those Japanese pilots. They were brave men, Rodriguez. Misguided, maybe. Fanatical, certainly. But brave. They flew into certain death because they believed it was their duty to their emperor and their country." Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, sir. I can respect that, even if I don't understand it. The tragedy is that they'd eat for nothing. This war is already over. Japan has lost. Their cities are burning, their fleet is at the bottom of the Pacific, and their army is trapped on bypassed islands. These kamikaze attacks aren't going to change that. They're just throwing away lives for a cause that's already lost. But we stopped them, sir. We're still here. Yes, we're still here. And we'll keep fighting until they surrender or until there's nothing left of them to fight. But I can't help thinking about those young pilots. They were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers. And now they're gone. all for a war that should have ended months ago. The klaxon sounded again, but this time it was the secure from general quarters signal. Around us, the ship's crew began the long process of cleaning up after the battle. Shell casings had to be policed up, guns had to be inspected and repaired, and ammunition had to be replenished. But there would be no rest for us. Intelligence was already reporting that the Japanese were preparing for another major kamikaze operation. Tomorrow, or the next day, we would be back at our battle stations, fighting for our lives against young men who had chosen to die. Rodriguez, I said, get the men fed and rested. Check the ammunition supply and make sure all the guns are cleaned and ready. We're going to tone them again soon. Aye, aye, sir. As Rodriguez headed below, I remained at the rail, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. The water was stained red by the dying light, and I couldn't help but think of all the blood that had been spilled in this war. American blood, Japanese blood, British blood, German blood. The blood of young men who had died far from home, fighting for causes they barely understood. But we had held. When the divine wind came screaming out of the sky, we had stood our ground and fought back. We had shown the world that American sailors and American ships could take anything the enemy could throw at us and still keep fighting. The kamikaze attacks would continue for another 2 months until the atomic bombs finally convinced the Japanese emperor to surrender. But April 6, 1945, would be remembered as the day when the largest kamikaze attack in history broke itself against the steel and courage of the American fleet. We had faced the divine wind and survived. And in surviving, we had proven that no amount of fanaticism could overcome the determined resistance of free men fighting for their country and their shipmates. The sun disappeared below the horizon, and darkness began to fall over the Pacific. But in the east, I could see the first stars appearing in the velvet sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new tests of our courage and endurance. But tonight, we were alive. The Birmingham was still afloat, still fighting, still defiant. And that was enough. As I headed below to check on my gun crews, I paused at the hatch and looked back at the peaceful ocean. Somewhere out there, in the depths of the Pacific, lay the wreckage of hundreds of Japanese aircraft and the bodies of their pilots. They had died believing they were serving their emperor and their country. I could respect that, even if I couldn't understand it. But they had failed. We were still here, still fighting, still free. And as long as ships like the Birmingham sailed the seas, manned be sailors like Rodriguez and the thousands of other Americans who had answered their country's call, that freedom would endure. The divine wind had blown, and we had weathered the storm. The price of victory was always high, but some things were worth any price. Freedom was one of them, and we had paid that price in full. The Battle of Okinawa would rage for another 2 months, but April 6, 1945, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval aviation. In that single day, they had lost more aircraft than in any other day of the war. 355 planes destroyed, along with their irreplaceable pilots. The Kikusui operations would continue through June, but each successive attack was weaker than the last. The Japanese had gambled everything on stopping the American advance at Okinawa, and they had failed. Their air forces were shattered, their fleet was destroyed, and their army was trapped on a shrinking island with no hope of resupply or reinforcement. The Birmingham would survive the war, as would most of her crew. But the memories of that day would stay with us forever. The sight of young men diving to their deaths, the sound of our guns firing in defiance, the knowledge that we had faced the ultimate test and emerged victorious. In the end, the divine wind had blown itself out against the steel and courage of the American fleet. And in that victory, we had proven that no amount of fanaticism could overcome the determined resistance of free men fighting for their country and their shipmates. The war would end 3 months later with the atomic bombs and the Japanese surrender. But for those of us who had stood at our battle stations on April 6, 1945, The real victory had already been won. We had faced the divine wind and survived, and that was enough.